Pay attention to 22-year-old nursing student Lakin Riley, jogging on the University of Georgia campus on the morning of February 22nd. She has her AirPods in and is holding her iPhone, completely unaware that she is running directly into a trap. Focus on her Garmin smartwatch. It is currently tracking her pace, but in exactly 23 minutes, it will record her heart stopping completely. Because Jose Ibarra is waiting in these woods. He doesn't know her, but he has been hunting for a target of opportunity. She will fight back hard enough to trap his DNA under her fingernails and trigger a 911 call at 9/11 that will never be answered. This is the murder case that changed federal law. This is the story of Lakin Riley. Lakin Hope Riley was living the life so many young people dream of. At 22 years old, she was a student at Augusta University's College of Nursing, pursuing her passion for healthcare with the kind of dedication that impressed everyone who knew her. She had previously attended the University of Georgia in Athens, and even though she transferred schools, she still lived in Athens and frequently returned to the UGA campus to run the trails she loved. Those who knew Lakin described her as a beautiful person, not just in appearance but in spirit. She was passionate about her healthcare studies, determined to make a difference in people's lives through nursing. Her former cross-country teammates from River Ridge High School, where she graduated in 2020, remembered her as an unselfish teammate, someone who always put others first and encouraged everyone around her. Lakin was also an active member of the Alpha Chi Omega sorority, maintaining those connections and friendships even after transferring schools. She had built a life filled with purpose, friendship, and promise. Her roommates knew her as reliable, punctual, never the type to be late or to leave people wondering where she was. On the morning of February 22nd, 2024, Lakin's day started like any other. She spent the morning at home in her apartment, hanging out with her iPad, taking notes, doing homework, and watching Netflix. She chatted with her roommate, Connolly Huth, about their weekend plans before Huth left for class around 8:45 a.m. Lakin was an avid runner, and that morning, she prepared for what should have been a routine jog on the familiar trails of the University of Georgia campus. She gathered her essentials, her iPhone, her Garmin smartwatch to track her run, and her noise-canceling AirPods for music. At 9:03 a.m., the Ring camera at her house captured Lakin leaving home, dressed in a black jacket, black leggings, and white sneakers, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. It was the kind of casual check-in that millions of daughters send their mothers every day, a moment of connection that seemed entirely ordinary. At 9:03 a.m., Lakin called her mother, then began listening to music as she started her run. 2 minutes later, at 9:05 a.m., a trail camera captured her jogging with her iPhone in her left hand, heading toward the intramural fields. At 9:06 a.m., she was last seen on camera turning toward the Oconee Forest Park area. Her mother called around this time, but Lakin didn't answer. Within minutes, everything would change. What should have been a peaceful morning run would become the University of Georgia's first on-campus homicide since 1983. The attack happened quickly, violently, and with devastating efficiency. Between 9:06 a.m. and 9:32 a.m., somewhere in the wooded trails of Oconee Forest Park, Lakin Riley encountered someone who would take her life. At approximately 9:10 a.m., Lakin's run was suddenly halted. In those terrifying moments, she managed to activate her phone's SOS emergency function. At 9:11 a.m., a 911 call was placed to the Athens-Clarke County Police Department, but Lakin never got the chance to speak to the dispatcher. At 9:12 a.m., just 1 minute after the call connected, her phone disconnected. Dispatchers, trained to recognize that silent calls can indicate extreme danger, attempted to call back twice. Both times, there was no answer. What they couldn't have known was that Lakin was fighting for her life, engaged in what prosecutors would later describe as a fierce struggle. Her Garmin smartwatch, still strapped to her wrist, continued recording data throughout the attack. The device tracked her dropping heart rate and her movement away from the running trail, deeper into the woods. At 9:28 a.m., the watch registered its final reading. Lakin's heart had stopped beating. Meanwhile, Lakin's mother continued trying to reach her daughter. At 9:38 a.m. and in the hours that followed, Allison Phillips sent increasingly worried messages. "Call me when you can," she texted. Then, as the silence stretched on, "You're making me nervous, not answering when you're out running." Calls from her mother and sister went unanswered, each failed connection deepening the family's growing dread. The attack itself was brutal. The perpetrator had attempted to assault her and had partially removed some of her clothing. When Lakin fought back, as the evidence would later prove she did fiercely, her attacker struck her head repeatedly with a rock. The final autopsy would determine that Lakin died from the combined effects of blunt force head trauma and asphyxiation. She sustained 8 cuts to the left side of her skull, a complex skull fracture, and brain bleeding, along with injuries across her ear, neck, torso, and limbs. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Lakin's roommate, Connolly Huth, grew increasingly concerned. Lakin was not the type to be late, not the type to simply disappear without communication. It was completely out of character. The roommates checked Lakin's location using the Find My feature on their phones, a tool that countless families use to maintain connection and ensure safety. The results were alarming. Lakin's phone showed she was still on the University of Georgia Trail, and more concerning, it hadn't moved in hours. Around 11:30 a.m., roommates Lily Steiner and Sophia Magana decided to search the area themselves. They headed to Oconee Forest Park, guided by the last known location of Lakin's phone. They searched the trails, calling her name, looking for any sign of their friend. They found one of Lakin's AirPods, a discovery that sent chills through them. But there was no sign of Lakin herself, and frustratingly, they had no cellular service in the wooded area to call for immediate help. They returned home, and at 12:05 p.m., they contacted the authorities to report Lakin missing. University of Georgia police responded immediately to the missing person report. Understanding that time was critical, officers began searching the Oconee Forest Park area, focusing on the location where Lakin's phone had last pinged and where her AirPod had been discovered. At 12:38 p.m., approximately 3.5 hours after Lakin's heart had stopped beating, a University of Georgia police officer found her body about 65 feet off the main trail, partially concealed in the wooded area. She was unconscious and not breathing, with visible injuries that made it immediately clear this was a homicide. Emergency medical responders arrived quickly but could only pronounce what was tragically obvious. Lakin Riley was deceased. The investigation moved into high gear. This wasn't just a murder, it was the first on-campus homicide at the University of Georgia since 1983, a shocking disruption of the safety that students and families had long taken for granted. University officials, law enforcement, and the community were stunned. Investigators began piecing together the timeline using the digital trail Lakin had inadvertently left behind. Her iPhone data, the trail camera footage, and critically, the detailed information from her Garmin smartwatch allowed them to reconstruct her final minutes with precision. The smartwatch had tracked not just her route and pace, but her heart rate as it dropped during the attack, and the exact moment her heart stopped. There was no indication the attacker had known Lakin Riley, no prior connection, no stalking pattern. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, encountering a predator who saw an opportunity and acted on it. But who was that predator? Police began reviewing campus security footage, looking for anyone who had been in the area during the critical time window. They appealed to the community for information, knowing that someone might have seen something, anything, that could help identify the person responsible. The breakthrough came from a combination of surveillance footage and physical evidence. Investigators identified a man who had been in the vicinity during the timeframe of the attack. His name was Jose Antonio Ibarra, a 26-year-old man from Venezuela who had been living in an apartment complex approximately 1 mile from where Lakin's body was found. On February 23rd, the day after the murder, police interviewed Ibarra. During that interview, investigators noted critical physical evidence, multiple scratches on his arms and red knuckles, injuries consistent with someone who had been in a violent struggle. The evidence against Ibarra began to mount rapidly. Surveillance footage from his apartment complex showed something deeply incriminating. At 9:44 a.m. on February 22nd, just 16 minutes after Lakin's smartwatch recorded her heart stopping, cameras captured Ibarra discarding items near his apartment dumpster. When police recovered those items, they found a bloody jacket and disposable gloves. The forensic analysis of these items would prove devastating to any claim of innocence. Hairs removed from the jacket were determined to have originated from Lakin Riley or someone with identical hair characteristics. More critically, DNA analysis found both Riley's and Ibarra's DNA profiles on the jacket. The gloves told an even more damning story. Riley's DNA was found on them, with forensic experts testifying that the probability of that DNA belonging to anyone other than Lakin Riley was 1 in 500 octillion. For context, that's a number with 29 zeros after it. The gloves matched others recovered from a drawer in Ibarra's apartment, establishing a clear connection between the evidence at the crime scene and Ibarra's residence. But perhaps the most powerful evidence came from Lakin herself. During her fierce struggle for survival, she had fought back. DNA matching Jose Antonio Ibarra was discovered under her right fingernails. A crime lab scientist testified that the probability of this DNA belonging to anyone other than Ibarra was 1 in 10 billion. Prosecutors would later describe this evidence by saying Lakin had fought for her life, fought for her dignity, and in doing so, she had ensured her killer would be identified. As investigators dug deeper into Jose Antonio Ibarra's background, a troubling picture emerged of a man who had fallen through multiple cracks in the system, each failure bringing him one step closer to encountering Lakin Riley on that February morning. Ibarra was an undocumented Venezuelan migrant who had illegally entered the United States via the US-Mexico border near El Paso, Texas, in September 2022. Federal authorities had apprehended him at the border, but he was subsequently released into the country while pursuing his immigration case, a common practice in an overwhelmed system. What makes Ibarra's case particularly frustrating from a law enforcement perspective is that he had multiple prior encounters with police before Lakin's murder, encounters that should have resulted in his detention but didn't due to various jurisdictional and policy issues. In September 2023, approximately 5 months before Lakin's murder, Ibarra was arrested in New York City. The charges were serious: acting in a manner to injure a child less than 17 years old, and a motor vehicle license violation. The circumstances involved Ibarra driving a scooter without a license while carrying a child who was not wearing a helmet, putting that child at serious risk. This arrest represented a critical missed opportunity. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, failed to issue a detainer before Ibarra was released by New York officials. A detainer would have held him for potential deportation proceedings. Instead, he was released back into the community. Just 1 month later, in October 2023, Ibarra and his brother were arrested in Athens, Georgia for theft and shoplifting. Once again, Ibarra was released. When he failed to appear in court for the shoplifting case, a bench warrant was issued in December 2023. But that warrant was never executed. Ibarra remained free, living in Athens, less than a mile from where he would eventually murder Lakin Riley. After entering the United States, Ibarra had initially stayed at a migrant shelter in New York before taking a flight to Georgia, where his brother, Diego Ibarra, lived. He settled into an apartment complex in Athens, blending into a community that had no idea a dangerous individual was living among them. The investigation into Lakin's murder also revealed another disturbing incident that occurred on the same day she was killed. Ibarra was charged with being a peeping Tom for allegedly spying on a student through a window on the University of Georgia campus. This charge suggested a pattern of predatory behavior, of someone who was actively seeking victims, watching for opportunities. As the case developed, Ibarra's defense team attempted to shift blame to his brother, Diego Ibarra. They suggested that Diego could have been responsible for the murder, or that Jose was merely an accomplice after the fact who helped cover up a crime committed by someone else. This theory was presented as an explanation for why Jose's DNA would be on the jacket and why he would have been discarding evidence. However, this defense strategy quickly fell apart under scientific scrutiny. DNA analysis excluded both of Jose Ibarra's brothers as matches for the DNA found under Lakin Riley's fingernails. The DNA under those nails belonged to Jose Antonio Ibarra, and the odds of it belonging to anyone else were 1 in 10 billion. There was no reasonable scientific doubt. The defense's alternate theory was further undermined by witness testimony. A woman named Stephanie Slayton, who lived with the Ibarra brothers, testified that Diego Ibarra had threatened to harm her if she told police what she knew about the investigation. This threat suggested Diego might have knowledge about the crime, but it also demonstrated a pattern of intimidation rather than evidence of his direct involvement. Diego Ibarra, who was later arrested for possessing an illegal visa, chose not to testify at the trial, exercising his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The picture that emerged was of Jose Antonio Ibarra as a man who had been given multiple chances, multiple opportunities where the system could have intervened and potentially prevented Lakin Riley's murder. Each arrest that resulted in release, each failure to execute a warrant, each missed opportunity to issue an immigration detainer represented a choice made by various agencies and jurisdictions that, in aggregate, allowed Ibarra to remain free and in position to commit murder. For Lakin Riley's family and for law enforcement officials who reviewed the case, These failures would become a central focus of frustration and, eventually, political advocacy for policy changes designed to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The prosecution of Jose Antonio Ibarra moved forward with the methodical thoroughness that major murder cases demand. A grand jury in Clark County indicted him on 10 separate charges, each representing different aspects of the crimes committed against Laken Riley and the subsequent attempts to conceal those crimes. The charges were comprehensive: malice murder, 3 counts of felony murder, kidnapping with bodily injury, aggravated assault with intent to commit an offense, aggravated battery, obstructing an emergency call, tampering with evidence, concealing the death of another person, and 1 count of being a peeping Tom related to the incident on campus the same day. Ibarra pleaded not guilty to all charges. Then he made a strategic decision that would prove significant. He waived his right to a jury trial, opting instead for a bench trial. This meant that his guilt or innocence would be determined not by 12 citizens, but by a single judge, Athens, Clark County, Superior Court Judge H. Patrick Haggard. The trial began on November 15, 2024, nearly 9 months after Laken's murder. Over the course of several days, prosecutors methodically presented their 17 separate strands of circumstantial evidence. Each strand alone was significant. Together, they formed an overwhelming picture of guilt. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence: the DNA under Laken's fingernails, the DNA and fingerprint on her phone, the bloodied jacket with both Laken's and Ibarra's DNA, the gloves with Laken's DNA matching at odds of 1 in 500 octillion. They presented the surveillance footage showing Ibarra discarding evidence. They presented the timeline constructed from Laken's devices showing exactly when the attack occurred. They presented testimony about Ibarra's scratches and red knuckles observed the day after the murder. The defense attempted to introduce reasonable doubt, suggesting alternative theories, and questioning the certainty of the DNA evidence. But the scientific testimony was clear and unambiguous. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Additional evidence came from an analysis of Laken's phone, where a left thumbprint with DNA matching Ibarra was discovered, further cementing the connection between the accused and the victim at the moment of the crime. On Wednesday, November 20th, 2024, Judge H. Patrick Haggard delivered his verdict. He found Jose Antonio Ibarra guilty on all 10 counts. The evidence had proven beyond any reasonable doubt that Ibarra had murdered Laken Riley. Following the guilty verdict, the court moved to the sentencing phase, where Laken Riley's family would finally have the opportunity to address the man who had destroyed their lives and taken their daughter from them. Laken's mother, Allison Phillips, delivered a victim impact statement that captured the devastating loss her family had endured. She described the future that had been stolen: watching Laken graduate from nursing school, meeting the man she would eventually marry, holding the grandchildren she would have given them. Every milestone, every celebration, every moment of joy that should have been theirs had been taken by one act of violence. Phillips urged Judge Haggard to impose the maximum sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. She wanted to ensure that Ibarra would never have the opportunity to take another life, to destroy another family the way hers had been destroyed. Judge Haggard, after hearing the victim impact statement and considering the overwhelming evidence of Ibarra's guilt and the brutality of his crime, agreed. He sentenced Jose Antonio Ibarra to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the malice murder count, along with consecutive sentences on the other counts. At 26 years old, Ibarra would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. He was transported to the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison, where he remains incarcerated. In July 2025, Ibarra's defense team filed a motion for a new trial, requesting a mental evaluation as part of their appeal. The motion remains pending, though legal experts consider it unlikely to succeed given the overwhelming evidence presented at trial and the thorough nature of the original proceedings. Laken Riley's murder generated widespread public attention and international media coverage, but what made this case unique was how quickly it became a focal point in the national debate over immigration policy. The case was heavily discussed during the 2024 presidential election campaign, with political figures using Laken's death to argue for stricter border enforcement and changes to immigration law. This political attention led directly to the introduction of federal legislation. The Laken Riley Act was proposed in the U.S. House of Representatives, mandating federal detention of undocumented immigrants arrested for burglary or theft, and allowing states to sue the federal government for failing to enforce immigration laws. The bill first passed the House on March 7, 2024, with bipartisan support, but stalled in the Senate. It passed the House again on January 7, 2025, as the first piece of legislation passed by the 119th Congress. An amended version passed the Senate on January 20th, 2025, and President Donald Trump signed the Laken-Riley Act into law on January 29th, 2025. For Laken's family, the legislative changes offered little comfort. No law could bring their daughter back or fill the void her absence created, but they found some measure of purpose in knowing that Laken's name had become attached to efforts to prevent similar tragedies. The case remains a reminder that behind every political debate about immigration policy are real victims, real families, and real consequences when systems designed to protect public safety fail to function as intended.